I'm going to tell you a story that changed how I see my family forever, and I need you to understand something before we begin. This isn't about revenge or vindication, even though for years I thought it was. This is about the moment I realized that the people closest to us can hurt us not because they're evil, but because they've been allowed to exist without consequences for so long that consequences become someone else's responsibility. My name is Sarah, and at 10 p.m. on October 15th, my brother Michael took my car keys, without asking. By 4:47 a.m., a brand new vehicle was wrapped around a steel guardrail on Route 9 just outside of Portland, Maine, and my father had already decided exactly who was to blame. But here's what nobody knew in those early morning hours. It wasn't even my car that was destroyed, and the person who caused it had spent his entire life believing that consequences were something that happened to other people, not to him. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. I need to take you back further than that October night because you can't understand what happened at 4:47 a.m. without understanding the years that led to it. I grew up in a house where fairness was a concept that seemed to apply differently depending on your gender and your position in the family hierarchy. My father, James, was a successful insurance broker in our community, the kind of man who wore Italian leather shoes and drove a Range Rover and believed that providing financially meant he didn't have to provide emotionally. My mother, Patricia, was a former interior designer who gave up her career when my brother was born and never quite forgave any of us for that sacrifice, though she expressed it mostly through passive-aggressive comments about how some people were born with silver spoons while other people had to work for everything. Michael was 3 years older than me, and from the moment he could talk, our father treated him like he was the heir to some invisible empire. I can remember being 7 years old, sitting at the dinner table while my father described Michael's mediocre performance in a Little League game as showing real leadership qualities, while in the same breath criticizing my straight-A report card because apparently I was too focused on grades and not focused enough on developing character. My mother would smile into her wine glass and say nothing. By the time I was in high school, I had already internalized the message that my achievements were expected and therefore invisible, while Michael's failures were rebranded as learning opportunities. He crashed his first car, a Honda Civic that my parents bought him for his 16th birthday, into a telephone pole at 2 a.m. while driving home from a party. The police report indicated he'd been driving without a license because it had been suspended 3 months earlier for speeding. My father's response was to buy him a new car within 2 weeks and have a stern talk with him about responsibility. When I got a speeding ticket going 8 miles over the limit 6 months later, I was grounded for a month and forced to pay for the ticket and the insurance increase myself, even though I was working part-time at a coffee shop to save money for college. My father said it was about teaching me consequences. I've spent a lot of years thinking about that double standard, and I realize now that it wasn't really about teaching me anything, it was about controlling me. It was about making sure I understood that no matter how hard I worked or how carefully I tried to follow the rules, I would always be the one responsible for cleaning up other people's messes. Michael's pattern didn't change as he got older, it just got more sophisticated. In college, he developed a casual relationship with a truth that would have been impressive if it wasn't so destructive. He would borrow money from our father with elaborate explanations about academic fees or car repairs or living expenses, money that he would then spend on expensive dinners with girlfriends or trips to music festivals or new technology that he simply had to have. When our father finally asked him to start repaying some of the loans, Michael would apologize profusely and promise to start working on it, and somehow within a month there would be another explanation, another emergency, another reason why the repayment had to be delayed. Our father would sigh and relent, and the pattern would continue. Meanwhile, I was working 2 jobs during my senior year of high school to save money for my first car, something I was determined to buy myself because I didn't want to be indebted to my father's conditional love. I bought a 2019 Honda Accord with my own money, and I remember the day I drove it home like it was the most important achievement of my life, because in many ways it was. It represented something larger than just transportation. It represented the idea that I could survive, that I could build something, that I could prove my worth through my own effort rather than through my father's approval. I was so careful with that car. I maintained it meticulously, I never missed an oil change, I kept it clean, I paid my own insurance, and I followed every traffic law with a kind of obsessive precision that probably made me look paranoid to other drivers. But I didn't care what other people thought. What mattered was that I had something that was entirely mine, something that my father couldn't use against me or hold over my head or frame as evidence of my irresponsibility. My brother noticed the car almost immediately, I think, because it represented something to him that he'd never had to work for, the simple fact of having done something solely through your own effort. He started asking to borrow it within weeks of me bringing it home, always with elaborate explanations about why his car was in the shop or why he needed something more reliable for a specific trip. I said no every single time. At first, he seemed surprised by this. I don't think anyone in our family had ever refused him anything before. Then he seemed angry, like I was being deliberately difficult or punishing him for some imaginary sin. He complained to our mother, who told me I was being selfish and that family helps family. He complained to our father, who said that perhaps I needed to be more generous and that my attitude problem was why I didn't have more friends. Nobody acknowledged that he had never been asked to be generous with anything, that his generosity was never tested because he was never required to share anything he didn't want to share. The refusals continued throughout high school and into my first year of college. Michael escalated his requests. He started showing up at my workplace and asking me in front of my coworkers. He started leaving passive-aggressive notes on my car. He started telling people that I was mean to him and refused to let him borrow things, framing himself as the victim of my unreasonable selfishness. My friends told me I was being stubborn, that it wouldn't kill me to let him borrow the car occasionally, that I was being unkind. But I knew something they didn't. I knew that if I gave Michael an inch, he would take not just a mile, but the entire highway system. I knew that the moment I allowed him to borrow that car, I would be responsible for whatever happened to it, because my father had already demonstrated how his mind worked. He wouldn't blame Michael for destroying it. He would find a way to blame me for being careless enough to let him borrow it in the first place. I was right about that instinct, though I didn't know it yet. The October night that changed everything started like any other evening in my house. My father was in his study reviewing insurance documents and making phone calls to clients in different time zones. My mother was in the living room watching a rerun of some home renovation show and drinking Pinot Grigio from a glass that she kept refilling every 30 minutes. Michael was somewhere between being home and being out, one of those ambiguous states he always maintained where his location was flexible and his plans were subject to change. I had finished my shift at the coffee shop at 8 p.m., grabbed a sandwich, and was planning to spend the evening working on an essay for my American literature class that was due the next day. The essay was about moral ambiguity in The Great Gatsby, and I was arguing that Gatsby's capacity for self-deception was his greatest tragedy, that his ability to lie to himself about Daisy and his past and his future was far more destructive than any external force could have been. I remember thinking about that essay the next morning, and how it suddenly seemed less like a piece of academic analysis and more like a prophecy. My brother came downstairs around 9:30 p.m., and I remember noticing that he was showered and dressed nicely, wearing cologne that was probably expensive because everything Michael chose to spend money on was expensive. He moved through the kitchen the way he always did, with a kind of casual entitlement that comes from never being told no, opening the refrigerator and helping himself to the leftover pasta my mother had made for dinner, eating directly out of the container without bothering to get a plate. My father didn't say anything about that, even though he would have said something to me if I'd done the same thing. Nothing my father did in those early evening hours felt unusual or suspicious. He was just my father being my father, arbitrating fairness in a way that was structurally unfair, dispensing consequences that only seemed to apply to certain people, maintaining a hierarchy that had been established so long ago that nobody in the family questioned it anymore. Around 10 p.m., Michael wandered into the kitchen where I was still working on my essay, my laptop open at the kitchen table, my mind fully absorbed in the question of how we lie to ourselves and what happens when reality finally forces us to acknowledge the truth. He stood there for a moment, and I could feel him standing there before I looked up, the way you always know when someone is watching you. He had that expression on his face, the one I'd learned to recognize over years of family dynamics, that mixture of entitlement and irritation that usually meant he wanted something he didn't think he should have to ask for. "I need the car," he said, not asked, not requested, with any semblance of politeness or acknowledgement that I might say no. I looked at him, and I said the word that had become my entire relationship with my brother. "No." He stared at me like I'd spoken in a language he didn't understand. "No," he repeated, as if the word itself was somehow grammatically incorrect or philosophically impossible. "Where are you going?" I asked, because I'd learned that sometimes context mattered, that sometimes understanding his plans might give me information about why this request was different from all the others. "I'm going out," he said, which was the least specific answer possible and which told me everything I needed to know about his intentions. "With who?" I continued, because the detail-averse response suggested he was going somewhere he thought I wouldn't approve of. He didn't answer that question directly. Instead, he turned and walked away from the kitchen, and I heard him say something to our father in the study, something quiet that I couldn't quite hear. I returned to my essay, to my analysis of Gatsby's self-deception, completely unaware that I was living in my own version of denial. I didn't hear my father say anything back. I didn't hear him come out of the study or acknowledge Michael's request. I just continued typing, the sound of my fingers on the keyboard creating a steady rhythm that felt safe and normal, and like the world wasn't about to fracture into pieces that I would spend years trying to glue back together. At 10:15 p.m., Michael came back through the kitchen. I saw him only peripherally. He was moving quickly, with purpose, toward the counter where I had left my car keys. I remember the silver keychain catching the light, a simple design that my mother had given me as a housewarming gift when I first bought the car, a tiny silver car attached to a leather loop. He picked up those keys like they belonged to him, and something in my chest tightened with a feeling I can only describe as a predatory awareness. "Michael, what are you doing?" I asked, already knowing the answer but needing him to say it out loud, needing there to be a moment where he had to acknowledge that he was taking my car without permission. He paused for just a fraction of a second, and in that pause I saw something flicker across his face, a moment of hesitation, a moment where he could have put the keys back down and asked me properly, a moment where he could have chosen differently. But he didn't choose differently. He never had, and he never would, because our father had taught him that consequences were always someone else's problem. "I'll have it back in a couple hours," he said, and then he walked out of the house. I didn't call after him. I didn't run to the door and physically prevent him from leaving. I didn't call my father out of his study to witness what was happening. I did something far more telling. I sat at the kitchen table, and I returned to my essay, and I typed out a paragraph about how self-deception is often a choice we make consciously, fully aware that we're lying to ourselves, but proceeding anyway because the lie is less painful than the truth. I think I knew on some level that if I didn't acknowledge what had just happened, if I didn't make it real by protesting or fighting or calling my father, then I could pretend that I hadn't just watched my brother steal my car. I could pretend that I would see him again in 2 hours, that the night would proceed normally, that nothing catastrophic was about to happen. I was wrong about all of that. The next 4 hours passed in a state of anxious semi-consciousness. I finished my essay. I read it over twice, making sure my argument was coherent and well-supported. I packed up my laptop around 11:45 p.m. and went upstairs to my room, all the while listening for the sound of my car pulling back into the driveway. The hours stretched out. Midnight came and went. 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. I wasn't sleeping. I was lying in bed in the darkness with my phone on my chest, waiting for a text message that never came. Part of me wanted to go downstairs and tell my father that Michael had taken the car without permission, that I'd tried to say no but he'd taken it anyway. Part of me worried that my father would blame me for being careless enough to leave the keys on the counter, that he would frame this as evidence of my irresponsibility rather than Michael's entitlement. Part of me was furious at my brother for putting me in this position, for making me responsible for his choices, for forcing me to be the one who would have to account for what happened next. Around 4:30 a.m., I finally fell into a shallow sleep, the kind of sleep where you're never quite unconscious, where you're always half aware of the sounds around you and the passage of time. I was jolted awake by the sound of my father's voice, not just talking, but shouting, his voice carrying up the stairs with a tone I'd never heard before, something between rage and panic that made my stomach drop immediately. I remember thinking, with absolute certainty, that something had happened to Michael. I remember thinking that my brother was dead or dying or seriously hurt, and that I was about to find out because I had been stupid enough to let him borrow my car. I scrambled out of bed and pulled on a sweatshirt and went downstairs, and what I found was my father standing in the kitchen in his bathrobe, his face flushed, his hands shaking, with his phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, I understand," he was saying to whoever was on the other end of the line. "Yes, my son was involved. Where is he now?" There was a pause, and in that pause I saw my father's face shift from panic to something else, some emotion I couldn't quite name, something that looked almost like shame, though I'd never associated that feeling with my father before. "And the car?" he asked. Another pause. And then he looked at me, really looked at me, and in that moment I saw something shift in his understanding of what had happened, though I didn't yet understand what that shift meant. "I see," he said quietly. "Thank you for calling. I'll be down to pick him up." He hung up the phone, and I was standing at the bottom of the stairs, and my father was standing in the kitchen, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. "There's been an accident," he finally said, his voice considerably calmer now, almost monotone. "Michael was in an accident about 40 minutes ago on Route 9. He's at Maine Medical Center in Portland. He's conscious. He doesn't appear to have serious injuries." I remember feeling a rush of relief so intense that I almost staggered. My brother wasn't dead, he was going to be okay, and then immediately on the heels of that relief came the fear, because an accident meant my car was destroyed, and that meant... And then my father said something that made all of that pale in comparison. "It appears," he said, in the careful, measured tone he used when he was trying to deliver information that he wasn't sure how to frame, that the vehicle involved was my Range Rover. I didn't understand what he meant at first. The words made sense individually: vehicle, Range Rover, involved, accident. But strung together, they created a sentence that didn't fit with my understanding of the events that had transpired. My car was parked in the driveway behind my father's car. Michael had taken my keys. So, how was my father's car involved in the accident? My father was looking at me, and I could see the question forming in his mind before he asked it. "Where's your car?" he asked. "It's in the driveway," I said. "Behind yours." My father left without another word. He just turned and walked toward the garage, and I followed him, still not fully understanding what was happening. The garage lights flickered on, and I saw immediately what he saw. My Honda Accord was exactly where I'd left it, parked carefully in the driveway, completely untouched, exactly as it had been when Michael had stolen my car keys at 10:15 p.m. My father stood there staring at my car, and I watched his face as he processed what this meant. Michael hadn't taken my car. Michael had taken his car, his Range Rover, the vehicle he drove himself, and somehow in the chaos of taking my keys, in the act of asserting his entitlement, Michael had gotten confused about which car was which, or perhaps, and this is the version I would come to believe, Michael had deliberately taken our father's car because it was faster, more impressive, more suited to whatever he had planned for that evening. My father didn't say anything. He just turned and walked back into the house, and I heard him go upstairs to his room, and then I heard the sound of him getting dressed, moving with purpose. He left the house within 10 minutes, presumably to drive to Portland to pick up my brother from the hospital. My mother never came downstairs. She never asked what had happened. She never seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted in our family, that the night had exposed something that had been hidden for a very long time. I went back upstairs to my room and sat on my bed in the darkness, and I thought about my essay on Gatsby, about self-deception and denial, about the way we construct narratives that allow us to avoid acknowledging uncomfortable truths. I thought about how my father had maintained this careful fiction for years, this story in which Michael was the golden child and I was the invisible one, and how that fiction had just collided with reality in the form of a wrecked Range Rover on Route 9. I thought about how my father would respond to this collision, and whether he would revise his story, or whether he would find some way to reshape reality so that it fit with the narrative he'd already constructed. I waited for hours, not sleeping, not moving, just sitting in the darkness and listening to the sounds of the house as it woke up. My mother eventually got out of bed around 6 a.m., and I heard her moving around downstairs, heard her make coffee, heard her turn on the television. I heard my father return home around 7 a.m., and I heard the car door slam with more force than was necessary. I heard the garage door open and close. I heard my father's footsteps as he came into the house, and I heard him climb the stairs toward his room. He didn't check on me. He didn't come to my door and ask me to explain what I knew about the previous evening's events. He didn't acknowledge that anything unusual had happened. He just went into his bedroom and closed the door, and I was left alone with the knowledge of what I had discovered, which was far more important than the knowledge of what had happened to the car. What I had discovered was that my entire family had been engaged in an elaborate fiction for years, and that the moment that fiction came into contact with reality, nobody knew how to respond. My brother had always been allowed to make mistakes without consequences. My father had always protected him from those consequences. My mother had always looked the other way. And I had always been held responsible for things that weren't my fault, blamed for situations I hadn't created, punished for crimes I hadn't committed. The accident exposed all of that with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. And once you see something like that, once it becomes impossible to pretend that your family is operating according to any kind of fair system, you can never unsee it. Over the following days, the full story of that night emerged in fragments and pieces, revealed through phone calls and insurance adjusters and police reports and conversations that I overheard while pretending to read in the living room. Michael had indeed taken my father's Range Rover, though he'd done so without asking, without permission, in exactly the same way he'd taken everything else in his life that he'd decided belonged to him. He'd driven to a party in a nearby town, a party at a house where there were other people, other witnesses, other evidence of what he'd been doing. The police report indicated that there had been alcohol involved, though whether Michael had been drinking or whether he'd simply been driving recklessly was never entirely clear to me. What was clear was that he'd been driving over 80 miles per hour on a road where the speed limit was 45, and that he'd missed a curve and collided with a guardrail, and that he'd been fortunate not to be more seriously injured. What was also clear, from the police report and the insurance company's investigation, was that the car had sustained over $100,000 in damage, that the frame was bent beyond repair, that the vehicle was totaled. I remember my father reading the insurance assessment out loud to my mother, his voice carefully controlled, as if the number itself was so large that it might explode if he spoke it with any emotion whatsoever. $120,000, he said. The car is a total loss. My mother made a small noise, something between a gasp and a whimper. My father set the document down on the table, and I waited for him to address the elephant in the room, which was that my brother had destroyed his car while driving without permission, and that there were clearly going to be consequences. What my father did instead was sigh, and then he looked at me, and in that moment I understood that I was about to be blamed for something that was entirely and completely not my fault. "I suppose," he said slowly, "that we're all going to have to make some adjustments. The insurance will cover most of the cost, but there will be a deductible and increased premiums. We may need to cut back on some expenses." He said this as if the accident was a natural disaster, an act of God, something that had simply happened to our family through no one's particular fault. He said this as if my brother hadn't stolen a car and driven it recklessly and destroyed it. He said this as if my brother wasn't responsible for the financial consequences of his own actions. "What about Michael?" I asked, and I remember my voice sounding very small and very far away. "What about him?" my father asked, as if the question didn't make sense. "Shouldn't there be consequences?" I continued. "The insurance will take care of the financial aspect," my father said, and I could see him mentally constructing the narrative even as he spoke, could see him rewriting the story so that it fit with the version of the world he preferred. "And Michael has learned his lesson. The experience of the accident itself is consequence enough." Michael had learned his lesson. As if nearly killing himself, as if destroying a $120,000 vehicle was a sufficient punishment for theft and recklessness. As if the fact that he was unharmed was somehow proof that he'd been taught something valuable. As if the universe itself had meted out justice by simply scaring him a little bit. I remember walking out of the living room and going back upstairs to my room, and I remember closing the door very quietly, and I remember sitting on my bed and thinking very clearly and very calmly that my father was a liar and that my family was built on lies. and that the only way I was going to survive the next few years was to stop expecting fairness and start expecting only the behaviors I'd been witnessing my entire life. I think that's the moment when I decided that I was going to leave, not physically but emotionally, that I was going to build a life that was separate from theirs, that I was going to stop trying to appeal to their sense of justice and start focusing on my own sense of purpose. I was going to survive not despite my family, but in spite of them. And that, in the end, was the real consequence that came out of that October night. Not for my brother, who faced virtually no consequences for his actions, but for me, as I finally accepted that my family would never be fair, that my father would never acknowledge my worth, and that the only approval I needed was my own. In the months that followed the accident, Michael seemed to move through the world as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't been the cause of a $120,000 disaster, as if my father's refusal to hold him accountable was somehow vindication of his behavior. He got a new car, a BMW, actually, nicer than the Range Rover had been, purchased by my father as a replacement, ostensibly because he needed reliable transportation, but really because my father couldn't bear the discomfort of witnessing his son's inconvenience. I watched this happen with a kind of cold clarity that I'd never experienced before. I watched my father reward my brother's irresponsibility with a more expensive vehicle. I watched my mother pretend not to notice what was happening. And I stopped waiting for the moment when things would change, when fairness would prevail, when my father would finally see me for who I was and acknowledge my worth. I accepted that moment was never coming. What I had discovered that October night wasn't a revelation about my brother's character or my father's parenting choices. I'd known about both of those things for years. What I had discovered was the limits of my family's capacity for honesty, the extent to which they were willing to distort reality to maintain a comfortable fiction, and the price that I would have to pay if I continued to expect them to operate according to any kind of moral code. The accident didn't just destroy a car. It destroyed my last remaining hope that my family would ever be different than they were. And once that hope was gone, I was finally free to become the person I wanted to be, without needing my father's permission or my mother's approval or my brother's respect. I was finally free to succeed or fail on my own terms, to build a life that was entirely my own, to prove to myself that I was worth something, not because my family told me I was, but because I knew it to be true. That's the real story of the October night when my brother took my car and destroyed my father's Range Rover. It's not a story about a car accident or insurance claims or the consequences of recklessness. It's a story about the moment I finally saw my family clearly, without the distorting lens of hope or expectation or familial obligation, and decided that I was going to build a different kind of life, one that wasn't dependent on their validation. And that decision, that moment of clarity, was worth far more than any car that ever existed.